Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME for Peace community, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These M&E Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground based in Washington, D.C. Today, I am delighted to welcome John Jordan and Daniela Galindez of Mercy Corps Guatemala, who are going to lead a conversation on preventing violence towards LGBT plus populations and how we monitor and evaluate those programs. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll make sure to address it once we reach the question and answer section. I'm now going to hand over to our hosts, John and Daniela. You are very welcome to the Thursday Talks. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Jack. And we're very excited to be here with the whole group. I'm John Jordan. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for the Como Vimos project. And I'm here with Daniela, who is the Gender-Based Violence Specialist for our project. Just two things before we start. First, you're going to hear my voice a lot. It's really because I'm more comfortable speaking in English, but the work that we're talking about today is really, it's Daniela's efforts that we're looking at. And I mention that not just to give credit where credit is due, but also because when we get to the Q&A section, you may hear me translating with Daniela and asking some questions in Spanish, and we'll get those back to you in English. And the second thing is that we really want to share where we've gotten so far with these efforts, but it's definitely still a work in progress. So we're very excited to kind of hear your questions and try and share as many responses as we can, but we expect that there will be some questions that we're going to say, oh, that's a really good question. We should go back and think about that as a project. So we might not have all the answers for all of your questions today. With that said, let's dive in. First, I'm going to breeze through a little bit of what Como Vimos is. It's a 5-year, $40 million USAID-funded cooperative agreement. This project, basically, we work to prevent crime and violence in communities across 6 of Guatemala's most violent municipalities. And the project is primarily implemented by Mercy Corps, but we also work with a consortium of local organizations. And then finally, our current agreement runs through June 2020, which means that, we're in the home stretch here. Project has 4 objectives. We focus on mobilizing communities to prevent violence. We also want to work with municipal and national government stakeholders, basically to help them partner with those communities. We support something called secondary violence prevention services, which are kind of more targeted towards the most at-risk people for participating in violence or victims of violence. And then finally, we have a research element that focuses on evidence-based policymaking. So we're going to start off looking at what are some of the challenges of addressing violence towards LGBT populations. The first challenge we kind of come across is that this violence is often an invisible problem. And this starts off with, if I said to you all, go out and, tell me even how many LGBT persons are in your country, it would be very tough to identify. And that's because Ministry of Health, police, the Attorney General, other justice sector actors, often, literally, their forms aren't capable of recording that someone is LGBT, is from the LGBT populations. And basically, what that means is if you have no way to record that information, well, at the end of the year, there are no violent acts towards that population because you were unable to record those acts in the official record. The next challenge that makes this problem invisible is that these populations often avoid or even are denied services or the care from these services that would help to identify them as victims of violence. So either health services or from the police or other other organizations that might be able to help identify that these people are victims of violence, they're just not reaching them because of the discrimination that they receive. And then finally, which is kind of a result of these first two factors here, it really isn't possible to understand the magnitude of the problem through passive data collection. The only way that we really can find out how much violence is happening towards these populations is by actively, carrying out studies, actively seeking the violence, because it's just not going to be recorded in the data sets that most countries are using. And so what we have is not even a baseline, but what we have that gives us some sort of idea about this are the studies that primarily LGBT organizations have carried out, with their own funding or with their own support to try and highlight these issues. Okay, second one is that, quite frankly, violence towards LGBT populations is a low priority amongst policymakers. It's a controversial topic, both politically and culturally, and especially if you have an election year, it's very easy to kind of demonize these populations or to be demonized if you are supporting these populations. The second point here is that one of these main sources of violence are police and security forces. So if you're going to talk about addressing this violence, you also have to talk about the fact that the institutions that are supposed to be protecting people are in fact the institutions that are creating a lot of this violence. And then finally, in many countries, both violence and discrimination, which we can understand as another form of violence, are culturally acceptable. And so there's not a big initiative to change because these practices are seen as kind of unfortunate.
And it appears we just lost your microphone, John. I don't know if there's anything we can do to pick that up again. I can see you're speaking, but for some reason the mic isn't working. Yeah, John, unfortunately, we have lost your audio. Your microphone doesn't seem to be working. Apologies to today's audience. We should have this back up and running in a matter of seconds. We see the microphone flashing. Any progress, John? Sorry about this, guys. We're gonna keep persevering here for the next few minutes to try and get this up and running. And try and get John's microphone back live. Okay, we are still down. Nope, unfortunately, John, we still cannot hear you. Listeners, John has messaged me to say that he is working on it and is asking if he can hear me, if we can hear him now. One of the things we try to do in the Thursday Talks, obviously, is create opportunities for participants around the world, even in those places that don't have the best Wi-Fi, to participate. So hopefully we'll be able to get John back online as soon as possible. John, I don't know if you want to try and close the GoToWebinar dashboard and try and reopen it. So you can restart the program, because what I'm seeing is that your microphone is live, but it might be a computer issue. Well, I'm going to use this opportunity to tell you guys about what's happening on DME for Peace in the coming months. We are currently accepting applications for the M&E Thursday Talks through the spring and summer. It creates an opportunity for you to share interesting and emerging practices about your work with the wider M&E community. And we're always trying to showcase new voices on the Thursday Talks, not just the ones that traditionally present at conferences, but ones that are new and are working on things that could benefit the entirety of the field. If you are interested in hosting an M&E Thursday Talk, please reach out to the DME for Peace email address. That is dme@dmeforpeace.org, and we'll work out a time that we can showcase your work to the entire DME for Peace community. As an update, John is about to exit the platform and try to re-enter. And fingers crossed, this will work for us. So John and Daniela are obviously doing amazing work. So it'll be fantastic if we can get them back online. And thank you for your patience throughout our audio technical difficulties. And you're back. We've got some audio.
Great. I am not the tech person to be able to figure out what happened there, but we can continue. Can you send me again to share my screen? Great. Okay, so you can hear me?
Yeah.
Great. And
you just want to put that in presentation mode?
Yep, there we go. Okay, we're back. So again, these hard choices that we were mentioning here. First is that the idea that we wanted to bring across here is that this is about more than just saying, okay, let's have a project that provides services. People won't show up if you just put out a sign that says we offer services for LGBT victims here. And so the first challenge here is that many of these cultural beliefs that we talked about earlier have been internalized. LGBT victims often struggle to recognize that they are in fact victims, or that this violence that they suffer is not deserved. Second, we can understand that in any situation there are fears about identifying yourself as a victim of violence. Those fears are amplified by the possibility of being outed by trying to receive these services. And so when they're sitting there saying, okay, is it worth it for me to get legal counseling, if by getting legal counseling I'm going to start a process that is going to out me as a member of the LGBT population, that also reduces the likelihood that people will arrive at services. And then finally, this relationship that we're talking about is not always immediately apparent. And the example that we've been talking about here is for transgender women, especially here in Guatemala. Because of discrimination, they can't find work. They're often kicked out of their houses. And so they end up in these very marginalized areas of the city. So they might get robbed or attacked, not because they're a transgender woman, not directly because they're a transgender woman, but because they're in these marginalized areas. But you have to look a little further and say, okay, why is this person in this community? And if they're in the community because they've been discriminated anywhere else that they've tried to live, then there is a relationship there that is they're more likely to experience violence because they are a member of the LGBT population. Okay, so what have we done? First step we focused on was raising awareness about the issues. Like we mentioned, there just there isn't a whole lot of data lying around about these issues. So our first step was we had to kind of go out and investigate ourselves. And so we published a study, a book that basically it was case studies so that we could have a piece to say, look, this is not something we're making up here. These are actual people living in Guatemala City who have suffered this violence. And then we're currently working on finalizing another study focused on violence and workplace harassment. The next step was about building credibility with local organizations because, quite honestly, our project doesn't have the connections, these sort of invisible or hidden populations that would allow us to provide services and know that they would come receive the services from us. So the first thing that we did was, while our organization is not our project is not necessarily a strong organization in terms of working with LGBT populations, we do have a lot of credibility with municipal actors, with these kind of local community organizations. And so we reached out to some of the LGBT organizations and said, look, we've got this opening with the municipal offices. Would you like to come and train them about human rights and awareness about LGBTI people? And so that was sort of our entry point to say, why don't you come take advantage of the space that we have that is a door that would otherwise kind of be closed for you? And then the other thing we said, and this is going to come up later as well, is we said, and also help us train our staff. As an organization, this is something that we need training in. We would love your help in training us as well. And then finally, and this is kind of where we're going in the future, is we're focusing on reducing the harm caused by the violence. Understanding that the challenges to reducing the actual violence itself because of all these structural barriers. What we're doing, the project in general uses a public health approach to violence prevention, which is not only focused on preventing violent acts, it's also focused on reducing the amount of harm that those acts can cause. So especially with these populations, what we're working on is, for victims of violence, how can we offer them the services that they need so that the violence that they've suffered it will always continue to affect them, but so that impact is lessened. So what have we learned so far? First off, LGBT plus isn't really LGBT plus. It's LGBT and then plus. We really have to be careful because sometimes LGBT plus is a nice way to say other, and it's not other. These are distinct populations that have distinct needs, and quite frankly, wouldn't otherwise be relating to each other, except that they're all sort of facing the same sort of discrimination, but both with our services, and we really picked up on it because we were doing focus groups, and initially we said, great, LGBT plus focus groups. and people didn't have the same ideas and didn't really feel comfortable sharing, you know, lesbians with gay men with bisexual population. They didn't want to be in the same focus group. They wanted to be in the focus group with people who had the same gender identity or the same sexual orientation that they had. Second, and I don't say this as a criticism of our project because I recognize that this is most projects in the world. We had to take a look in the mirror about what we were doing. Our own staff, and you know, not saying that our staff is worse in any way about this, had trouble understanding sex, gender, sexual orientation. And so we recognized that we had to start training our staff. It's not just about implementing a project here, it's about our staff understanding these issues. And these are issues that they hadn't understood from childhood, because here in Guatemala, you know, they're not topics that are taught in elementary school or in high school. So we had to kind of step in and help that process. One of the really great things that we found out along the way is that these local LGBT organizations were really enthusiastic about helping us to improve. And in some ways, it's unfortunate that this is the reality, but they've received quite a lot of training on you know, look, everybody's going to have these kind of discriminatory ideas, rather than sort of rather than criticizing these, help people improve. And so many of these organizations were very open to, like, if you want to listen, I think the line that they always use is, feel free to ask. That's what we're here for. And so really not feeling ashamed that our organization didn't know, you know, didn't have a wealth of experience in the topic, and really saying the organizations were here to help. They knew that was the situation, and they didn't come in to criticize. They said, that's okay, you know, we're so happy that you're interested in getting better. And then finally, inclusive data collection. It's about more than just adding another variable to our Excel spreadsheet. We are, in fact, still in the process of adjusting our M&E tools to capture data. And every time we have a new tool, we kind of have to go through and say, okay, how do we need to adjust this to reflect gender identity or sexual orientation as well? And this has also meant that we had to train our M&E staff on sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And the main reason why we had to train them is because when they're out in the communities, many people don't understand these concepts as well. And so if you just have a form that says, okay, you know, check the box for, are you know, lesbian, gay, heterosexual, people aren't going to understand. And not just, they're not going to know the definition of the word, they're not going to understand the concepts of gender and the concept of sexual orientation. And so we really wanted the people who were going to have contact with the community members, our M&E staff that's out there in the field collecting data, that they understood these concepts, so that when people in the communities could ask, they could explain it. And it wasn't just, I don't know, check whatever box, but really could help explain these concepts as well. Okay, what's next? So we're continuing to train our staff and update our processes. One of the challenges that we continue to face is that, again, this idea that recognizing or having inclusive data collection is one category that is other. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex are not all the same thing. And oftentimes, you know, the M&E staff at the beginning would have a category that's like, okay, lesbian, gay, transsexual, cross-dresser, and it's like, yeah, those aren't all the same thing. We're not talking about the same level there with all those different categories, because someone could be multiple categories, multiple of those options. Next, we're going to be providing services for LGBT victims of violence. And one of the interesting things that I think we're doing here is we are adapting a model from HIV prevention, which is an area that actually has worked fairly heavily with LGBT populations. And so we're kind of saying, okay, let's take one of these models that they've had for providing care about HIV and see if we can adapt it to violence. And then we're creating spaces for participation throughout our project. So services is a bit different, and we do want to have specialized services, but we found, especially for kind of advocacy purposes, it's better to incorporate LGBT participants in the kind of existing power structures rather than saying, okay, let's have the LGBT commission that nobody's going to end up listening to. And then finally, we're continuing to learn. The organization we're working with to provide services, we just talked with them last week and kind of said, we're both going to be learning from this because you guys have never worked in violence prevention and we don't have a lot of experience working with LGBT populations. So like, let's keep an open mind and see what we learn along the way. There we go. We made it.
We did. We survived. Thank you, John, for the presentation, and thank you for eventually sort of working out those tech issues. I think what you've done is provided a great overview of the amazing work of Convivimos, and I think globally we're undergoing a phase of learning regarding the needs of LGBT plus communities, and that's going to have huge ramifications for the way that we design programs in peace building and development and human rights, not only from a conflict sensitivity perspective, but just a general understanding. So now to our loyal audience who persevered with us throughout the tech issues, we're now going to open up today's presentation to questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar. That will allow you to type your question. The second is to click on the little hand icon on your GoToWebinar dashboard, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace's media gallery, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to today's presentation and learn from our wider discussion. Now, I'm going to kick things off here by using my moderator's privilege, John and Daniela. And one of the things I found most interesting was the process of sort of understanding the needs within your staff towards it, sort of improving their understanding of the LGBT plus of sex and gender. How did you go about educating them? Could you talk a little bit more about the trainings you carried out, as well as how you identified these issues with your team?
Mm-hmm. ¿Que conteste yo? Okay, so I think that, you know, the first step is just acknowledging that, and I don't want to limit this to Guatemala, because the truth is this is a global challenge, is understanding kind of where your baseline is. That globally the baseline is that most people don't understand, you know, gender identity, sex, sexual orientation. These aren't concepts that people are really well versed in. And then I think that we didn't necessarily do a specific evaluation of our own organizational knowledge. It was just sort of recognizing that baseline. We said, if we're going to work in these topics, we need to increase our own staff's knowledge and capacity. And what we did is we partnered with these local organizations and said, these are topics that our staff doesn't necessarily understand. We would love if you guys could help present about them. ¿Lo has hecho también aparte?
Sí, sí se han hecho
Danielle,
capacitación.
Daniela has also helped to lead, as part of her role, she's helped to train the staff as well. But really what we did is borrow from these organizations that a lot of what their work is carrying out trainings and kind of awareness raising activities trying to answer these questions.
Great, thank you guys. The next question comes from Jen Wilton, and Jen writes, if inclusivity is about more than adding a variable, are there particular monitoring and evaluation methods or tools that have worked well in this context?
Que si hay herramientas o técnicas de monitoreo que han funcionado muy bien, que conoce.
Bueno,
So, de BH, aquí allí tienen,
tienen fichas técnicas, por ejemplo, las organizaciones, sí.
Yeah, so I think there are, and one of the good recommendations here is there are not necessarily great monitoring techniques within the kind of peace building world, but what has really helped is looking towards especially HIV, because globally men who have sex with men are a key population for HIV transmission, and so there's been a lot of investment in developing tools and engagement strategies with either with men who have sex with men. And so that's kind of what we're looking at right now. It's definitely one of the topics that we'll work out. The partner organization that's going to provide the services is currently in its pre-award survey. So once they make it through that survey, we'll work with them to kind of say, okay, let's see the tools, your monitoring tools, and adapt from that.
Great, thank you guys. And just a call to the audience, maybe you or your organization have some interesting M&E methods or tools that have worked with sort of measuring the effects on LGBT plus communities. Please feel free to share them with us, and I'll make sure that they are shared with everybody who is attending today's webinar. The next question is a raised hand from Grania Kilcullen. Grania, your microphone is now live. Please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, Grania.
Thanks very much for this presentation. It's Grania here from Christian Aid Ireland, and it's really just interesting to hear your approach, because we also work with a partner organization in El Salvador called FESPAD, who are working very specifically with transgender group, and I suppose maybe my question is one around kind of the policy aspect of your program, and kind of if you've had any gains in Guatemala, because I know from FESPAD even last year they've had some quite a positive success in relation to the court recognizing the identification and approving a change of the name and sex of a transgender person, which is really quite positive for, you know, trying to do the other outreach around raising awareness. And I suppose I was just wondering, is there something similar happening at the policy level in Guatemala? And then the other question really is just in relation to when you talk about sort of adapting the model from HIV to violence, and I know you probably have a bit more thinking maybe to do on that, but I'm just wondering if you would be engaging kind of local organizations that are working on violence prevention specifically as well, and one of our partners in Guatemala, Caja Ludica, are doing a lot of work, and I'm sure you're very aware of their violence prevention work on youth. And so I suppose I'm just wondering what outreach or kind of partnerships you're having with local organizations that are working on violence, but maybe not specifically on LGBT plus. Thanks.
Yep. So I think looking at the first part of the question there, yeah, Guatemala. So in fact, we were having this discussion yesterday that Guatemala has actually made some strides in terms of that first point about recognition, both in that the forms that the police use, that the essentially the Attorney General's office uses, the human rights ombudsman and the Ministry of Health use have started to include more, collect more data. It's been in the last 2 or 3 years, so it's definitely a positive trend that we hope will continue, and also you know, the same about being able to, I believe in Guatemala right now you can change your name, but you can't change the sex on your official records. So that there have been a little bit of progress. This actually is so part of the outreach strategy that that we're going to use for the services. One is it basically has three parts. One is a sort of promoters who are going out and giving kind of general charless presentations about workshops to generate interest in the services. The second is actually going to be targeted advertising through social media, and then the final one is working through the project's network of partners. Our primary local, our community mobilization partner is Funda Espro. If anyone here is from Guatemala, is working in Guatemala, and so working through these networks that we've kind of already established, but certainly, you know, other organizations that were interested in hearing about the process, we'd be happy to get them, you know, to link them into what we're doing as well.
Great, thank you guys, and thank you, Grania, for asking your question live. Our next question kind of builds on this a little from Laura McGrew, and Laura asks, or writes, you said that you were working on creating spaces for LGBT plus participation throughout your project. Does this include within the government?
Yeah. So primarily the municipal governments, but part of what we've managed to do, you know, a lot of the focus of that objective 2 of the project has been elbowing violence prevention into the kind of municipal agenda, and so we've really been working to create commissions focused on violence prevention and support those commissions in their work within the scope of the project. And so what we've said is, okay, we've already managed to get violence prevention on the agenda with these municipal governments. You know, rather than having a sub-commission or something else, let's just kind of use a little bit our ability, our influence to say, okay, we really want to encourage these commissions to have LGBT participants as well. And yeah, so yeah.
Que también se dan talleres sobre diversidad, sensibilizar a padres y madres sobre.
Yeah, and so we're actually, when we first did the presentation or the work with public officials, it was, you know, people in these offices in the commission said no one has ever come to talk to us about what is gender identity before, and it's you know, that may very well be that the organizations were there willing to do it and they wouldn't open the door, but regardless, it is something that is kind of a new topic. So we're continuing to kind of raise awareness to help open these doors, but also using our specific influence that the project has to say, wouldn't it be great? And you know, here's this great person who should be on the committee. So that's kind of the strategy that we've used there.
Great, thank you, John. Our next question, point of interest, comes from, I'm pretty sure this is Joan Marshall-Mizier. And Joan writes, I'm interested in learning more about the analysis tool that was used to design the program and how the gender or feminist lens may have been utilized.
So I think one of the things I was thinking about saying is, you know, I would love to be able to say, oh yes, this was something that from day one we designed it into the program, and you know, look where we've gotten today. What that approach that we have there is really more a post facto reflection on the route that we've taken to get to where we are today, and a lot of it has sort of been trial and error, and let's do things and see where it arrived. Another point that's worth mentioning is that part of this was in our cooperative agreement that we had to work, we had to carry out activities, which is quite frankly, you know, credit again to USAID, that it's not something that often appears with such emphasis in these sorts of grants or agreements. So we had interest from our donor in carrying it out, but it hasn't necessarily been a well analyzed and designed approach. It was more of a let's figure it out along the way approach.
Great, thank you guys. As we're getting up to time, I'm going to use this opportunity to wrap up today's presentation. Thank you, John, and thank you, Daniela, for your great work on this. Y gracias por todo su trabajo. To use my pidgin Spanish. But this is really interesting, and I hope that you're able to share some of the tools you end up developing as you continue to work with the Convivimos project. Thank you to our audience for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. You guys are what make this webinar series extra special, and we really appreciate your input and contribution throughout. Just a note, the recording will be posted online on the DME Media Gallery this afternoon, so please feel free to return to it, continue the discussion in the comments, and share with your colleagues who might find this interesting. We're going to be back in 2 weeks' time as we welcome Linda Stern of the National Democratic Institute, who's going to lead a discussion on community-based participatory research with marginalized communities. Should be a great discussion. We're very excited to host it, and thank you all for joining. Thank you, John. Thank you, Daniela, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thank you.